Hello everyone, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and here's my first card using the June 2017 Blissful card kit from Simon Says Stamp. So I did the unboxing of the kit the other day and I had so many of you saying you couldn't wait to see cards made with it. So I finally got a chance to sit down and play, and I cut down some of the Ranger watercolor paper that comes in the kit. So I cut it down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I have the smooth side facing up. And then I placed it in my Misty, and I'm inking up the stamp with the Barely Beige ink pad that comes in the kit. Now, anyone who's watched my videos for any length of time knows that when I'm watercoloring, I generally either will stamp the image in black or I will heat emboss it. And I had struggled here. I was like, oh, I really want to heat emboss this. Or maybe stamp it in black. I don't do the no-line watercoloring. I love the look of it. I don't have the patience for it. It's not my forte. This ink pad, that's what I was kind of thinking is more, I was like, oh, this is going to be more of a no-line look. I don't really have time for this. I don't really want to do this. But I stamped it anyway. And what I ended up discovering as I started watercoloring this is, if you really went slow, you could totally do the no-line look and it would look beautiful. But since I don't have the patience for that, I was just coloring like right over it. And I'm using the little blobs of watercolor that come in the kit. This is just Daniel Smith watercolors that have been squeezed out of the tube, and then they let it dry, and they include this little piece of watercolor paper with the kit. And all you got to do is touch it with a wet paintbrush, or I'm just using a water brush here, and that reactivates the color, and you can watercolor with it. So I'm just doing as simple as possible, just picking up color and applying it. I'm not doing anything fancy. When I first started doing this, I was like, this looks horrible. I don't like it. I don't know what I'm doing. The stamped lines kind of, I guess the easiest way to explain it would be absorb the color. And at first I was like, I'm not sure about this, but I was like, keep going and we'll just see how this looks as I add more color and whatnot. So I did the 3 kind of main flowers first, and I did these little buds with the pink watercolor that is included. And the more I did it, I was like, I actually really was liking how the stamp lines were basically absorbing the color, and they would get like darker with the color of watercolor I was using. And it gave it just this really nice definition. I actually, by the time I was done with this, I was like, I want to do this more with this specific ink pad. Like, just stamp images in color, because I don't feel like I need to do any fancy no-line coloring, and you still keep all the definition of the image whereas usually if you stamp with, say, distress ink and things like that, a lot of times you'll lose that definition and you basically have to paint it back in. That's why I don't like no-line coloring, because it just takes forever. But this, it just worked. So I went along, did all the flowers first, and then for the green, I pulled out my little plastic palette here, and I'm just mixing the green and the gold color watercolor together to get a more yellow tone green, and then just painting it. I'm not painting in those lines on the leaves. Those are part of the stamp, and then as you add the color over it, those just get enhanced. That's where I was like, this is just the funnest thing. I don't know, maybe everybody knows this little tidbit when stamping with lighter inks like this in watercoloring, but this was kind of new to me and I thought it was pretty cool. So I just went along and just added color here and there. I was adding a second layer of watercolor just to give it a bit of definition, but for the most part I'm just coloring it in, like basic coloring in with watercolor. So anybody can do this, doesn't take any skill, and it's fun, and it just looks so neat when it's done. So I was going kind of back and forth doing both these images, and when I had all this green mixed up, I went and did the other image, the greens first, just because I wanted to keep the color kind of consistent here. So for these other leaves and the buds, I just mixed in more green than that gold yellow color, so that there'd just be a little bit of differentiation between the greens. And then for the flower centers, I just mixed all the colors together. You get a muddy mess. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted kind of a muddy brown color. So I mixed all the colors together, and then I used that for the flower centers. And since I'm going kind of back and forth between each side of this piece, everything's drying quite easily between them. So I can just go in, add my, go on to the next flower, go on to the next bud, etc. and watercolor, and I don't have to wait for anything to dry, because that's another reason why I don't like doing like the no-line thing or just stamping images and watercoloring them, because you have to make sure each area is dry before you go on to something right beside it. Otherwise, they're all going to bleed into each other and you end up with a hot mess. So with this, it was actually pretty easy. and the colors dried fairly quickly, and it just worked. I was pleased with it, thankfully, because in the very beginning there, I literally was sitting there and I was like, this is a mess, and I don't have time for this. So I just took my time and watercolored everything in on each end the exact same, added the little dots of the muddiness, and then when it was all done, I looked at it and I was like, I could go around all the edges. That's what I would normally do, go around the edges, and add a bit of color, but I was like, that would take forever. So instead, I just smushed the little worn lipstick Distress Oxide ink that comes in the kit onto my palette here, and then I'm just flicking against the edge of it with my water brush and creating a little bit of a pink splatter, and I was happy with that. So I set that aside, and then I'm using Simon Says ivory cardstock. So I cut the sheet in half, so it's 4 1/4 by 11 inches, and I'm going to score it at 5 1/2 with my Teflon bone folder. So this will be a top folding A2 sized card. And I did try really hard to use other pattern papers that come in the kit, but I couldn't stop myself. I flipped through it and I was like, I tried really hard. I did. Looking at the other papers and I was like, no, I need to use this black and white stripe. I had to. So I pulled that out and decided to trim off the ends of this watercolor piece. So I trimmed off about a 1/2 inch off each side. I was only going to do one side, but because of the way I'd stamped it more centered, it just looked better to trim off each end. So I trimmed off 1/2 inch from each side, and then I trimmed down 2 strips of the black and white pattern paper there, just cutting those slightly wider than that 1/2 inch so that I'm not wasting, a full piece of the pattern paper, because you got to save the black and white stripe. It goes with everything. So after I trim those down, I'm going to adhere those directly to my card base. So I'm just going to run adhesive all along the back of these, the length of the card. It's just easier this way to let the pieces hang off the edge. So adhered both of those with my adhesive, just lining it up with the top of the card where the fold is, and then lining it up with the sides so that none of the actual card base is peeking through. So got those adhered, and then I can flip this over and trim off those little pieces hanging over the edge with my scissors so that everything is lined up. So I did that. And then I was originally going to just adhere this like that. And I was like, it's missing something. It needs a little something more. So I hadn't thrown out these little strips left over from the watercolor panel. And I was planning on doing some embossing for the sentiment. So I just pulled out some scrap paper. And I'm just going to press my Simon Says clear embossing ink pad onto these strips of watercolor paper here. And then I'm going to coat them with, this is Simon Says ultrafine gold embossing powder. So I'm going to coat that with the embossing powder, and then I'm going to use my reverse tweezers just to hold this while I heat it with my heat tool. And then once I heat that, I've got a nice little bit of metallic cardstock here. So I did that with both of these strips, just pressed it down with the ink pad, coated it with the embossing powder, then melted it with my heat tool. It doesn't need to be neat because you're only going to see a tiny little bit of it anyway. So once I had both pieces embossed, I grabbed some black cardstock, which also comes in the kit, and since I've got everything sitting out, I'm going to do the embossing for the sentiment as well. So I'm going to treat my black cardstock with my anti-static powder tool so that I can stamp the word congratulations that comes in the Floral Bliss stamp set. So stamp that with the clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to use that same ultrafine gold embossing powder. Again, when I was making this card, my original idea was to do white embossing on black, which is normally what I do, but I was like, oh, the gold will look really pretty with this color combo. So hence gold. And same thing, since I had everything sitting out, I was like, oh, I should stamp and emboss the sentiment on the inside too. Why not? So I grabbed another sentiment from the set, Let the Bliss Begin. And I used my anti-static powder tool first on the inside of the card, and then stamped the sentiment with the embossing ink, and then coated it with the detail gold embossing powder. And I'm going to melt that with my heat tool, so getting it all done at the same time so that I can clean up all of my embossing powder in that, because my tendency is to knock things over, especially embossing powder. So funnel that back in the container, put the lid on, and then while I had the card base here, I'm going to put that back in my Misty, and I'm going to stamp that floral cluster image with the same barely beige ink again. It's really hard to see on camera. You can kind of see it at the pictures in the end, but it just gives them just a nice kind of almost tone on tone look to the inside of the card with those flowers, which just finished it off. So I did that. And then my original intention was to adhere these little strips with the gold embossing first, center them up and line them up, and then adhere the watercolor panel on top of it. And then as I was doing that and trying to figure it out, I was like, this is going to take me forever to like line these up, you know, perfectly. And then I'm like, why not just adhere them to the watercolor panel? So sometimes my thought process is completely backwards, and then I get it. So once I figured that out, I applied adhesive then to the very edge of the watercolor panel itself. And then I can adhere these little strips with the gold embossing, because I just wanted the gold embossing to peek out a little bit as if it was a strip of like gold paper. So lined that up completely as like straight as possible and got those adhered to either side of this watercolor piece. And that just kind of brings out the gold, which will bring out the sentiment just a little bit more, I think. So got that completely adhered, and then I was happy with that. So then I can apply the adhesive to the back of this, all along the edges and the center, like being quite generous. It didn't warp too much with the watercoloring because I wasn't using a whole lot of water, but I still like to be generous with the adhesive to make sure that everything just stays in place. And then I adhered that to my card front, and then I'm going to trim down the sentiment with my paper trimmer. It was kind of funny that after I trimmed out, I realized it just happened to be the exact width of this piece from the gold to the gold embossing there. But I decided I didn't want to just leave it just straight like that, so I used my scissors to cut little notches in each end. So you cut one down the center, and then you meet up each end with each corner, and then you have little flag ends on either side, just to give it that little extra something. So once I'd cut those down, I can flip this over and add some adhesive and then adhere that to the front of my card here. And again, kind of fiddled with where I was going to place it and decided it just looked better in the center anyway. So got my adhesive, got that adhered into place, and that finished off this card. So other than just playing around with the watercoloring and getting a little frustrated with myself in the very beginning, this was a really easy card to make. I'm going to have to play some more with this particular stamping, barely beige ink and watercoloring, and just see where it goes. As always, I'll have links below the video to my blog post and links to all the supplies used. All that info will be in the description box below, so check it out if you're interested. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon in another video. Bye!